Red Earth, or War-Zard as it's known in Japan, is probably the most obscure 2D fighting game developed by Capcom. Released in late 1996, it was the first game to use the CPS-3 hardware, which is the same board that Street Fighter 3 runs on. I've covered this period in time before, but to recap, the mid-90s was an insane period for fighting games. Although the 3D revolution was well underway by this point, it was still a massive time of innovation for 2D fighters. 1996 in particular saw a number of games push the boundaries of the genre, and Capcom was at the forefront of this innovation with games like Alpha 2, X-Men vs Street Fighter, and of course Red Earth. Red Earth wasn't as influential as Capcom's other fighting games, but it was the most unique. It only has 4 playable characters, for example, and it includes RPG-like elements. It was also a visual tour de force, showcasing huge character sprites and an increased level of animation over previous Capcom fighters. Sadly, it was a commercial flop. Not because it was a bad game, it reviewed well enough with the critics at the time, there were just a number of external factors at play that meant that it never stood a chance. It came out at a point where 2D games were falling out of favour, and arcades in general were beginning to struggle. The game did get a Western release, but being a new and unknown IP, arcade owners were apprehensive about spending money on the new hardware required to run it. There were also other games from established franchises which ran on existing cabinets. Mortal Kombat, Samurai Shodown, King of Fighters, and Street Fighter all had new entries, making '96 an incredibly competitive year. And that's not even mentioning what was happening in the 3D space. This made Red Earth a risky purchase, resulting in a limited number of machines being sold in the West. It was a moderate success in Japan, but remained an arcade exclusive until very recently. The rapid demise of arcades, particularly in the West, meant that Red Earth's time as a playable game was limited, and it quickly fell into obscurity. So in this video, I'm going to take a look at its history, the gameplay, its legacy, and what your options are for playing it in 2024. Ultimately, I just want to talk about what I think is one of the most fascinating Capcom games of the 90s, and a truly hidden gem. Red Earth was originally planned to be a conventional fighting game. However, during the inception phase, one of the producers, Takashi Sato, said that there was a feeling that the skill level between fighting game players was growing, where more casual players couldn't keep up with the more top-tier players. This desire to make the game more accessible to the casual audience convinced them to rethink certain aspects of the game's design, and it's why a character progression system was included. Earlier Capcom brawlers Magic Sword and the King of Dragons served as inspiration, not only for their fantasy settings, but also because of their progression systems, which would become the template for Red Earth. Additionally, the game was intended to showcase the power of Capcom's new CPS-3 board. This would end up being Capcom's last proprietary board, and along with significant improvements to security to prevent piracy, it was capable of much larger sprites, many more frames of animation, and features like sprite scaling. Red Earth takes full advantage of all of these with massive and beautifully animated sprites. The camera pans back and forth, tracking both fighters and increasing the visible play area, all while maintaining a rock-solid 60 frames per second. The artwork was handled by Capcom mainstay artists, who had previously worked on other games such as the Alpha series, Alien vs Predator, Darkstalkers, and the crossover games. The character design and animation is hugely impressive, and you won't find bigger and more detailed sprites in any other Capcom fighter. You can tell that the team who created it really wanted to push the boundaries of sprite work, and I think this is one of the most visually attractive examples of pixel art for a game ever created. Due to the limitations of console hardware at the time, Red Earth wasn't ported to a home system. By the time the Dreamcast arrived, the poor commercial success in the arcades and the relative obscurity of the game ruled out any chance of a home conversion, and Red Earth would end up being the only CPS-3 game not ported to the system. Emulation would eventually become possible, but it took over a decade due to the challenges of reverse engineering the CPS-3 security. Even when ROMs did make their way to the internet, getting CPS-3 games to run wasn't always straightforward, and I'm sure you know what I'm talking about if you've ever had to track down a CHD file. So for the average gamer, it remained locked to the arcade for 26 years before finally being ported to current hardware in 2022 as part of the Capcom Fighting Collection. Now, it wasn't simply bundled into the collection to boost the number of titles. Producer of the collection, Shuei Matsumoto, said that Red Earth was actually the impetus for the collection. A couple of OG Capcom programmers, Kabuta and Mumu, had approached him about bringing the game to current systems, and this is what kickstarted the project. And while Red Earth remains one of the more obscure titles in the collection, its significance can be seen in the game's key art, where Leo features prominently. Red Earth has one of the most in-depth story modes of any Capcom fighter of its time. Every character you fight has their own stage intro, and in between matches you get a cutscene with some dialogue. The story is set in an alternate fantasy version of Earth. 'Tis the year of our Lord 13XX, or if you play the Japanese version, 1999. It's a pretty standard Capcom story. An evil dude, this time it's the Sorcerer, has taken over the world and sent out his minions to wreak havoc on the lands. It's your job, regardless of who you choose, to set out on a quest to defeat him and restore peace. Each of the 4 main characters have their own unique version of the story. The order you fight each boss and your interactions with them differ, but the beats are more or less the same, and you always fight the final 3 bosses in the same order. As much as this game focuses on the story, it's still pretty thin and full of wacky dialogue. Think of a slightly more fleshed out version of a typical Street Fighter campaign. There are different endings to unlock by completing specific criteria, but once you've played through it with each character, there's little reason not to skip the cutscenes on repeat playthroughs. The core of the game is set up like a typical 2D fighter. You fight across a 2D plane, you have a variety of character-specific moves and combos, there are special attacks, super attacks, and orb attacks, which are magical attacks a bit like the ones from Golden Axe, and the story mode, or the quest mode as it's called, sees you travel the world facing off against 7 different opponents before fighting a big bad boss. There are 2 bonus stages, not unlike those from Street Fighter 2, except that here you earn XP instead of score. They're okay, but they're definitely not the most creative bonus stages I've seen. So all of that is your standard 2D fighting game stuff, but there are a few differences that make this unique. The first is that each battle is like a boss fight. Your opponent has a massive life bar that is displayed at the bottom of the screen, and instead of rounds, the fight ends when either your opponent's life bar or your life bar is depleted. In the quest mode, you earn experience. During matches, your opponent drops items like coins and gems, and collecting these adds to your overall XP. The higher your level, the better your character's defenses are to elemental attacks. You also unlock more powerful weapons and additional moves. There are also treasure chests that appear which contain orbs, and even items that can restore a small amount of health. Orbs allow you to perform elemental attacks, and there are 5 different types. Some orbs seem to be more effective on specific bosses, like the fire one being pretty good against Hydron. You can only carry 3 orbs at a time, and you can choose which one you want to use. If you pick up a 4th orb, it's just absorbed as additional experience. Elemental attacks are the same for all 4 characters. However, you can spend orbs on super combos, which are called Mystic Breaks. It costs 1 orb to perform these, and each character has their own unique attack, with some characters having more than one. A lot of articles online will tell you that this game has fatalities, and while it is slightly more violent than other Capcom games of the era, there's nothing here that will make you wince. They're not really fatalities either, you just get different win animations by finishing the match with a specific move. Kenji has the closest to something you might find in a Mortal Kombat game, but the others are pretty tame. What's interesting is that the level cap, which is 32, is impossible to reach from a single playthrough. Even if you somehow get a perfect run, there's no chance of reaching the level cap in the first few runs. So the idea is that you replay the quest multiple times, and there's a password system that lets you save your progress. The password system is pretty clever. It only uses numbers 1 through 6, and it maps these to the 6 attack buttons, which makes it pretty quick and easy to punch in a password if you're playing on a stick or a fight pad. Now, Red Earth is a proper arcade coin muncher. In other words, it's a brutally hard game, especially if you're not super confident with fighting games. Most of the characters have full screen attacks, moves that can take off a huge chunk of your life, and cheap tactics like unblockable meaties. And of course, the final boss is the cheapest bitch of them all. He has a variety of full screen attacks that he can do simultaneously, he has projectiles, a teleport, and the ability to completely prevent you from attacking for a short period of time. On top of all of this, your health doesn't completely regenerate after a match, a bit like the survival mode in Alpha 2. Thankfully though, if you need to continue, and trust me, you're going to need to continue a lot, your opponent's health doesn't regenerate either. So if you get stuck on a character, you can slowly chip away at them until you win, rather than needing to start from scratch every time you continue. Now, that description might make it sound like pure torture to play, and while cheap deaths are occasionally infuriating, it's still incredibly entertaining to play against the CPU. I've seen it described as a boss rush, and I reckon this is a pretty accurate description, although if you don't like this style of game, then consider yourself warned. Another big departure from other fighting games of the time is the size of the roster. There are only 4 playable characters in both the quest mode and versus. It has no secret characters or cheats to play as any of the boss characters either, at least as far as I'm aware of. It does have some hidden things to discover, but definitely not to the degree that had been commonplace in other Capcom fighting games in the 90s. It's unclear if this was a deliberate design choice or a compromise to get the game out faster. Versus mode is similar to the quest mode, except that only the 4 playable characters are in it. You still need to punch in a password too if you want to play as a max level character. Versus feels like a very different game, because you never fight any of the other playable characters in the quest mode. So while the mechanics are the same, the opponents are different. Matches are more conventional too, being best of 3 rounds with regular sized health bars, and as a result matches feel much faster. Playing online, you should expect to be categorically thumped until you spend some time with the game. I think the changes made to make the game more accessible to newbies sort of work for the quest mode, but there's nothing in the versus mode to help less skilled players. The orb attacks are kind of easy to pull off, but that's about it. I think it's worth pointing out that if you aren't interested in deep diving the game to max out each character, or you're looking for a really solid story to sink your teeth into, there isn't much game here. Playing through the quest mode takes about 15 to 20 minutes, and with only 4 characters you can see most of what the game has to offer in about an hour. But Red Earth was clearly designed to be replayed. Not only will you need multiple playthroughs to reach the level cap, but as I mentioned before, there are alternate endings for each character. Beyond this, and despite only having 4 playable characters, it's a pretty deep fighter. Like all of Capcom's other fighting games, there's combos and strategies to learn, and all the 4 characters play very differently. So if you want to sink the time in to get good, you'll be rewarded. What's really interesting, at least I think so, are the various mechanics, moves and systems that made their way into other Capcom fighters. Pocket Fighter uses both the orb and progression systems, only progression is modified on a per match basis, resetting at the beginning of each fight. The black orb attack also looks suspiciously like Gil's super from Third Strike. And the final boss can shrink you down into a childlike form, in the same way that Alessi can from JoJo's. Something else which I noticed, which is totally weird but also kind of awesome, is that the music on the map screen appears to be a pretty close match for the main theme from GoldenEye 007. Although that game came out in '97, so GoldenEye copied Red Earth? Now your options for playing it in 2024 are still slim, but a shitload better than they were a few years back. Yeah, up until 2022 the only way to play it was either emulation or an original arcade board, and arcade boards need to be treated with maximum respect, or they'll suicide, rendering them unplayable. I don't think anything beats the visceral experience of playing on an arcade cabinet, but the version in the Capcom Fighting Collection is pretty damn good, and has a few extra features. It came out for just about everything too, including the Switch. This version of the game lets you choose between the Western and Japanese releases. It's got a decent training mode with things like hitboxes and input data. It gives you access to a bunch of dip switches, including the ability to set all characters to level 32 by default. It has heaps of behind the scenes stuff to look at, and it even has online lobbies. If online is the main thing you want, you could also give Fightcade 2 a go. I don't know how easy it is to find other people to play with, but if you strike out with the Fighting Collection lobbies, at least you've got another option. If you want to get good at the game and find other people to play with, there is a small but dedicated fanbase. Guile Winquote has a great video that discusses the game from more of an FGC perspective that I'd recommend checking out if you are an FGC person. He provided some links to a very detailed wiki and a Discord, which I've linked in my description too. I've also dropped some codes below, so if you don't want to grind to the level cap, you can just enter a code to get a level 32 character. Outside of the various external factors that limited the game's success, it's not hard to see why it didn't gain much of a following or a standalone home port. The quest mode is fun and maxing out each character requires a few hours, but the versus mode is extremely limited. With only 4 characters to choose from, it's no surprise that it didn't have much of a competitive scene. For these reasons, it's unsurprising that Red Earth never got a sequel, although its characters have turned up in heaps of other games. From Capcom's own stable, there's games like Gem and Pocket Fighter, Street Fighter V, and a few of the crossover games. The most interesting of these is Capcom Fighting Jam. A lot of people don't rate this game, but it does let you play as 2 of the boss characters, Hauser and Hydron. This gives us a glimpse at what a sequel might have looked like, assuming subsequent games let you play as the boss characters. It's also kind of amusing to see a T-Rex Dragon Thing clothesline Ryu. Tessa even appears in an SNK game as a playable character. Okay, yeah, so it is a Street Fighter crossover and it doesn't use the Red Earth sprite, but it's still interesting. Despite its issues and brevity, Red Earth is still very much worth checking out. It isn't your typical Capcom fighter. It looks and plays very differently from basically every other game that Capcom has put out, and there are a few 2D games that can match its presentation. It's an incredible example of Capcom at the height of their pixel art powers, and something of a swan song for the 2D era, and it's definitely worth experiencing at least once.